Hey, good to see you again. This video is part 2 of a 2-part video about the new local adjustments and masking tools that Adobe recently added to Camera Raw, to Lightroom, and to Lightroom Classic. And in this video, we are going to take this raw image here and transform it into this primarily through the use of local adjustments. In case you're curious to know what this photo is, and because you're probably going to be looking at it for a while, this is an image that was from a recent video here on my channel where I reviewed the new Canon RF 24-70mm and compared it against the older EF 24-70 Mark II, a qualitative comparison to see what the differences were with regard to sharpness, detail, and clarity, and all that good stuff. And the backdrop for that video was this junkyard that I found up in North Georgia, this place called Old Car City that had like nearly 5,000 vintage American cars that were just rusting out in the woods. And it was this crazy place. I was wrapping up for the day and I'd been there for hours. I thought that the owner might just, lock up and go and close the gate. And so I was in a bit of a rush trying to get out of there. And when I was leaving, I happened to look over on my way out and I saw this pickup truck, this old rusted out pickup truck, and the door was open. And I looked inside of it and there was just all this red and orange rust around the interior of the cabin. Fantastic. I mean, just so cool. Okay, so let's jump in here and take a look at the original straight out of camera raw image shot using the R5 here with the RF 24-70. Originally, the image had this little bit of the window frame sticking in up here at top right, and I wasn't the biggest fan of that, so I ended up cropping that out. Whenever you have something that is lingering around the edge of the frame, I find it to be just visually distracting, especially because, with something like this windshield here that is just extending up into that corner, you kind of want it to just keep going, through the frame instead of, putting something in the way there, because it just doesn't feel quite right. First global edit I want to make is the profile, which by default is Adobe Color, but I would rather use a camera matching profile. And this is especially important with raw images captured from the EOS R5 and the R6, because for months after these cameras came out, there were no camera matching profiles in Lightroom or Camera Raw. I don't know why, I don't know what the holdup was, but they simply weren't there, but they are there now. And so we finally have faithful and landscape and neutral and portrait and monochrome and standard. Now, just look at the difference when I mouse over standard and then mouse off of it. This is just default Adobe Color here. And then this is standard. And this, camera standard, this is using Canon color science here, to take that raw data and to, create that rich color that Canon cameras are just known for. It's something they've always been known for. It just looks a lot better. It's a better place to be starting from, especially with an image like this one. So I'm going to choose camera standard. And then speaking of color, the next thing I would like to do is come all the way down here to the bottom of the develop panel to the camera calibration area. What I want to do here is I want to further enhance the color in the image. I want to just deepen and kind of thicken up that red and that orange a little bit more. And a good way to do that, if you're looking to deepen the color in your shot, is to adjust the saturation of the blue primary channel. And I can just push this up to like right around here somewhere. And if I toggle this on and off, you'll see that the red and the orange just looks a little bit brighter, a little bit thicker. It behaves a little bit differently than vibrance and saturation and targeting colors in the HSL panel as well. And when it works really well. So if you haven't messed around with camera calibration and tried adjusting saturation of blue primary, try that with your photo sometime. Next up, I want to adjust the exposure because the histogram up here is indicating that the tonal values are leaning a little bit towards the left. I think it'd be a good idea just to go ahead and bring up the midtones a little bit. So I'm going to bring them up just a little. Don't want to go crazy here, but just something just to add a little more light into the midtones of the image. And then the next thing is compressing the dynamic range, because this is a rather contrasty image. I want to bring the whites and the highlights closer towards the middle. It's kind of like we're pushing things together, and then later we're going to pull things back apart again, purely so that we are the ones in control of where and how contrast is being applied. So let's just drop the highlights down a little bit, which close them in a little bit. That's a good place to park it for now. So let's look at a before and after here. Here is the before, this is where we started, and this is where we are now. Pretty big change, right? I mean, just purely from changing the profile and making some slight adjustments to camera calibration and to the exposure settings. That feels like enough for now. Like, I mean, there's some global things that we can come back and do later, like finishing steps on top of the local adjustments. But for now, my goal here was just to get a better baseline to start working with, a better technical baseline, so that then we can start applying some local adjustments. Now, when making this transition from global editing to local editing, we are moving from making broad changes to the entire image to making very specific, very selective local adjustments to individual areas of the shot. Before doing anything, just kind of take a moment and sit with the image and think about, what is it that is most important here? There's a lot going on in this particular image. Like for example, we have this back window back here with the back floorboard, the edge of the seat. We have the driver's side window, the seat itself underneath the steering wheel. The steering wheel, we have the dashboard, and then we have the windshield. And something that helps me at this phase in trying to figure out what is it that I want to change and what is it that I want to edit is to assign a numerical value to each one of those elements. Like if you were to just do like a visual audit of everything and assign a relative value to each, what would those numbers be? So like, for example, with me, I would give the steering wheel and the dashboard like, I don't know, probably like an 8 or a 9. That's really important to me. The windshield is also pretty important to me as well. I think that is a big part of the atmosphere of the image. So I would give that probably around a 7. Driver's side window, probably around a 7 or a 6 as well. And then the bench, or rather the seat underneath the wheel, I feel like that's fairly important, maybe around a 5, something like that. Everything else would be lower on that scale. Everything else would be like around a 2 or a 3 or a 4. The brighter something is in your shot, the greater the likelihood is that the viewer is going to think it's important. It feels like the light is just all out of balance in the image. Like the light is highlighting areas that have a low qualitative scale, and the areas with higher qualitative scale are darker on the luminance scale. So that is a way, I think, to establish some direction with your dodging and burning, so you kind of have an idea of where to go next. So we're going to come over here to the new masking tool, and we're going to click on linear gradient, and we're just going to drag in a linear gradient from the side of the frame over here. Now, I demonstrated this in my last video. Let me just go ahead and name this really quick. But one of the things that we want to do here is we want to bring down the light in that particular area of the shot, but without pushing the shadows into the blacks. We don't necessarily want to lose detail there. So what we can do is to click on the little ellipsis here, then do intersect mask width, and then choose luminance range. Now we are going to bring up the luminance range by pulling this up from the blacks a little bit and see what's happening over here on the left side. The darkest areas on the left-hand side of the image are starting to drop out, are no longer being affected by the mask. And this little arrow here, as I demonstrated before, this is feathering. So when it's right up next to the range, you have a really hard clip. And that's not what you want. You want it to be much smoother, a nice smooth roll off like that. So typically what you do when doing luminance range is just, first bring up the range and then feather it thereafter. Now, something that I think is also really important is to not get ahead of yourself at this phase. When you're starting to dodge and burn, think about these edits as being incremental edits, because later in the image, I'm going to be adding contrast. Like, I know that that is a finishing thing that I'm going to be doing more of later. So I don't necessarily want to be making like a final adjustment here, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to make subtle changes in brightness values just to even things out a bit and just get it into a better baseline. So right now, that's really all I feel like I need to be doing. It's a subtle change, but it's an important change. Okay, next, let's go ahead and tackle this, this windshield up here. I wanna go ahead and bring some more light into that particular area. So I'm going to create a new radial mask. Just gonna make this a little bit bigger than I'm really going to need. Now, what I would like to do, as I talked about before, this is an important part, I feel, of the composition. I mean, this is one of the elements that I want to accentuate. So with that, it needs to be a little bit brighter and not quite so gray. So I'm gonna bring up the exposure here a little bit. and right about there. And the next thing I want to do, and this is something I actually talked about in part one way to brighten light and create more atmosphere is to apply a negative dehaze. And when you do that, it just reduces the clarity and makes it look a little less precise, if that makes sense. So something like that. So let me toggle this layer on and off. Wow, yeah, see the difference? It's quite a change, right? I mean, we are really bringing some light into that area. One of the things I'm noticing though is that the light is starting to bleed into these other areas that I don't really want. So we can come back over here, do another luminance range, and now I'm going to exclude some of the red and black areas on the interior of the cabin because I just want the light on the windshield itself. And yeah, I feel like we're getting just a nice, natural, glowing look to this windshield now. Okay, so alongside the front windshield, the other thing that I said was important was the steering column and the dash here. So again, we're going to use a radial gradient. Again, luminance range, and I'm going to exclude some of the bright areas because I don't really need to be adding more light there. So now our mask is just confined to the wheel and the dash here. Again, we're not trying to make huge edits here, like just little improvements here and there to get started with. Okay, so let's do a check and see where we are with the before and after. So we have before here, and this is after, and let me just toggle the masks on and off. Now you can already see that the light is starting to shift, right? Less light on the left side, more light is being introduced over towards the right where I want the viewer's eye to be. Okay, the next thing I want to fix is the seat. So let's go ahead and do the left edge of the seat. Now this, as I said before, is a rather unimportant area of the shot, but it is super bright. So we need to bring down the exposure quite a bit here. Just gonna pull this down to like right around here. Now, one thing you may notice sometimes when you are burning something that was bright beforehand, they tend to look a bit gray, and it's purely because they were originally bright and you made them darker. So oftentimes whenever I'm pushing highlights down and I'm pushing them closer to midtones, I try to introduce some color. And that could be easily accomplished really by using the temperature slider here. Let me actually toggle this on and off. And so yeah, we're not only getting the luminance under control, but we're avoiding that grayness that I was talking about. Now, if you really want to, you could also pull back some more of that saturation just so it looks a little more natural. Yeah, I feel like that looks pretty good. Now, I darkened the whole edge of the seat as a whole, but it's still rather noticeable. So it's kind of like we completed phase one of the seat, but I feel like there's one more thing that we could do here, and that is to further darken like the bottom of the seat so that it is less noticeable. Well, a thing you can do so that you don't have to recreate the mask is just go to the ellipsis and then do duplicate, and we'll do duplicate seat, and we'll call this seat burn. I'm going to get rid of the luminance range. I don't need that. I do need the radial gradient. I'm going to only apply some extra darkening to the bottom of the seat. I don't want it to affect the top. Well, to do that, we can do, let's see, we can click on the mask, do subtract, linear gradient, and then we are going to draw a linear gradient that is subtracted from the radial gradient so that the darkening effect is only applied to the bottom of the seat here. So bring that down a little bit. Now it's starting to look a little gray on me again, so I'll introduce a little bit of color through temperature, and yeah. Okay, so that looks right. So that's where we were before, and then that's where we are now. So we have brought the exposure down. I think if we push it any further, it's gonna start to look kind of fake and kind of unnatural. So that's about as far as I can go, but definitely helped reduce its visual prominence in the image. Okay, next, and this is the funny thing about dodging and burning, is that oftentimes when you start lifting some areas and pushing some other areas down, the unedited areas will suddenly stand out a lot more. So like one area that's really standing out to me is the seat down here reflecting the light from the window. A bit too bright. So let's create another mask. We're gonna do a radial gradient again. Yep, and so now we've pushed that further down. Okay, next, let's do the driver's side window. You see how, like the trees in the back here, the environment outside the window, they are somewhat in focus. Like visually, they are competing in a sense with what's going on inside the cabin. And the first thing I'm going to do is bring down the dehaze slider. And already you can see how much of a difference that's making. Now again, we don't want to go totally crazy here because then it's just gonna get way too glowy and kind of weird looking. So if we toggle that on and off, see how much of a difference that makes? Okay, so I feel like we've made some pretty notable changes to this image so far. Now I think is a good time to be kind of focusing on some select areas within the image, just a little bit of something, just to lift them a little bit. And I think a couple of good examples here. One would be the steering column on the wheel here. Like I feel like that could use a little bit more just visual interest. So I'm gonna let's just draw a really skinny radial gradient. I think also these, I just love these knobs and like the key and everything that are down here. So let's do another radial gradient. Okay, so let's do a checkup for where we are. Obviously, we've created a lot of masks here. So here is the before. Wow. Yeah, we've really come a long way, haven't we? And now this is the after. We've just completely transformed the light inside of this cabin here. Like it's completely shifted. So now that we've been like lifting some areas and dropping some of the other areas and creating a more balanced exposure, I feel like we're at a point now where we can kind of start to back out a bit more. Like think a little less about the local and start to return back to the global again, because now we have an even better baseline to be working from. But I'm not quite done with local adjustments here. So what I would like to do is further darken and kind of finish off some of the areas of the shot here. Let's layer on another linear gradient. And we're going to darken we're just gonna add a little drop of exposure down here to the bottom. And this is going to affect everything. Now, of course, because it's affecting everything, we don't want to go too hard with this. We just want a little bit of darkening. And then in that same vein, we have the far right of the image. See how the dashboard is kind of bright over here? And we can bring this side down a little bit. And I think we'll do a little bit on the left too. Okay, so I feel like I've done enough local adjustments here. Like I don't feel I need to be doing anything more. And now it's time to go back and take a look at the global view. Typically for me with raw photo processing, it's kind of like, you start global and then incrementally you get more and more specific over time, more and more localized. And then towards the end, you kind of pull it back out again. It's almost like an accordion or something. I don't want any pure whites in the shot because if this was published, say, on a white background, if there was any white, like along the edge of the frame or something, it would just bleed into the white background. So I always just pull that down like a notch or two, bringing up those blacks a bit. And I'm gonna lock the midpoint. Let's put that in the center. Add just a subtle S-curve here. Another nice finishing touch you can do is to come in here to the parametric curve. And this is almost like the curve within the curve, if that makes sense, because we've already established like a nice S-curve. We can pull down, where do I go with this? I'll push up the lights just a little bit, bring down the highlights some, raise the shadows just a little bit. Now we turn off the tone curve. That's what it looked like before. And we turn it back on, right? And so now it has like a slightly more filmic kind of vibe to it. Like the highlights are looking a little bloomier, the blacks are a little lifted a little bit. Okay, now let's come down to the effects panel. Now think of the effects panel as being like that little extra bit of sweetener at the end. It's like the top layer of the cake, the icing, that little finishing touch that just gels the image together. Now, what I want to do here is just add just a little bit of vignette, just not much. And this actually gets back to what I was talking about earlier with the linear gradients and the masking. And this is a good example of why you don't want to go too heavy a lot of times when you're making those local adjustments, because especially if later you're going to be doing some finishing like this and some extra darkening, here and there just to finish things off. You're not trying to do everything in one mask. Like, think about it in like slow incremental steps, or at least that's what works for me, is to, just slowly kind of incrementally work my way towards where I'm trying to get to. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of grain. Now, I know some people are going, oh no, you don't want to add grain. What are you adding grain for? It's a digital image. Digital images are supposed to be clean, and point well taken. I mean, I think some people get really fixated on detail and sharpness, and they see grain as being like the antithesis of that. It seems backwards to be, to care about detail and sharpness, but then again, add grain to something. But I kind of see grain as being, like I was saying just a second ago, as being like that connective tissue. There's just something about it that just gels things together a little bit more. So that is without grain, and that is with the grain. Hopefully you can see the difference. I think it just adds a little something. I was actually reading an article the other day about when they created Dune, they shot everything digitally, but in order to make it, I think in the words of the director, he wanted to be more human, is how he referred to it. And so they transferred the digital to film, and then rescanned that film back to digital again in order to give it that texture, and to give it that grain and that natural look, and to kind of warm it up a little bit so it's not quite so clinical. I thought that was a really interesting. So at this point of the edit, I feel like this is a really good time just to stop and just kind of back away from it for a little while. Like, get away from it for like, I don't know, for like a day or two if you can, because you need to give your eyes a moment to reset and kind of get the image out of your head so that you're able to come back and look at it with a fresher set of eyes and decide if there's anything more that you need to do. Maybe you went a little too heavy at first with your edits. I have a habit of doing that. Sometimes just pushing it a little too much. That's one of the reasons why I typically don't, like, as soon as I'm done editing something like this, just export it and put it on Instagram or on my website. I try to avoid that until at least I've had some chance to come back and reset and look at it again. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what about sharpening? Isn't sharpening something you want to do? Definitely, sharpening is important, but for me, sharpening is a thing that is done when an image is exported. When you sharpen for wherever the image is going. So, sharpening for print is different than sharpening for an image on a website, which is different than sharpening for an image on Instagram. Typically you want to go heavier with your sharpening with a print, very heavy actually sometimes with a print. And then Instagram could be a little bit sharper too because the image is being downscaled so much. So sharpening is typically not something I bake into an image in Lightroom. I prefer to do that later in Photoshop. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. Maybe you even learned something new about Lightroom today, or, hey, maybe you just enjoyed hanging out with someone and watching them edit their work, because I know I love doing that. I love watching other people edit their photos and videos. I could watch that kind of stuff all day long because there's always something new and something interesting to pick up by seeing how other people approach, common problems, things that I know I experience with my work, and it's always interesting to see how other people do it. So hope you enjoyed this. And hey, now that you've been staring at this photo for a while, maybe you should check out the video from which it came. I will link to it. It's over here, right? Yeah, I think that's right. Thumbnail's over here. Check it out. See you next time.